This is lecture number 11, The Era of Good Feelings, between 1817 and 1825. We left off with the presidency of James Madison, another Democratic Republican. We left off with important themes like, to give you context, the War of 1812 had come to an end. New economic system to continue American prosperity, the American system. These were some of the events that took place under James Madison. And how also the Hartford Convention pretty much had eliminated the Federalist Party. So we have one party rule, the Democratic Republican. In the election of 1816, James Monroe would become President of the United States, another Democratic Republican. And it was said with his presidency came an era of good feelings. And the reasons behind this so-called era of good feelings nationalism, pride in the nation. Because of the War of 1812. To Americans, it was a victory. We defeated the British a second time. There was an intense set of nationalism. There was one political party, it appeared, that we didn't have a lot of divide politically because we had now one political party, the Democrat Republicans, because the Federalists, well, they still have some power in the court system. Because of the Hartford Convention, they would no longer have the power they once did in regular politics. There was this optimism of exploring out west, the opportunity of exploring out west because of the Battle of Tippecanoe and how the native confederation led by Tecumseh was defeated. So there was optimism in traveling out west. There was a feeling of economic independence. Remember the embargoes that were used against the British and the French during the Napoleonic Wars. Short term, they were not very productive, but long term, we had this economic independence. We were able to survive it and continue to grow economically. So these are the reasons entering the presidency of James Monroe, it was called an era of good feelings in American politics. But you can question that because there will be developments that take place during his presidency where we're beginning to see fractures, division in American politics, in American society that will take place between these states. We already saw it at the end of Madison's presidency with his American system. A second national bank would divide some of the political leaders. Tariffs would divide the North and South. And internal improvements, the only thing that didn't pass from the American system. And there's nothing that can divide someone like an economic crisis. In 1819, we're going to go through another economic crisis. It was called the Panic of 1819. America will go through an economic recession. The biggest victim of this recession, poor Western farmers. This financial crash caused many of them to lose their land and farms that they had gained, that they invested in the West. Now, one of the causes of this panic of 1819 was the fact that banks were reckless. Banks gave out too many loans that couldn't be paid back. This is called over-speculation, where banks gave out too many loans that could not be paid back. So this set off an economic chain reaction of problems in America. But to the Western farmer, to the biggest victims of the Panic of 1819 and the common man, They blamed the Bank of the United States. They blamed Eastern bankers, wealthy Eastern bankers. And of course, the government that they felt represented them the most. So this Panic of 1819 is evidence that it wasn't such an era of good feelings. Another issue that's going to arise during this era has to deal with slavery. Here's the dilemma. The territory of Missouri, as we acquired all this land from Louisiana, the land of these territories will eventually apply for statehood. Missouri applies for statehood in 1819. And this brings about a division over slavery in America. Now, don't get me wrong, America is not as progressive. The division is not about the morality of slavery. The issue is about extending slavery because that could give more political power to southern states. Missouri was a territory that wanted slavery, and the northern states were concerned because this would tip the balance in the Senate to the states that practice slavery. They would have more senators than the North would. Now, Northern congressmen right away tried to do something about it. A representative out of the House of Representatives by the last name of Tallmadge. Again, this came from the House of Representatives. A Northerner made a proposal. It was called the Tallmadge Amendment. It was a proposal to eventually phase out slavery in Missouri, right? To allow them to come in as a state, but slavery would be eventually phased out. This was the proposal, the Tallmadge Amendment. More specifically, no more slaves could be brought into Missouri, and the children of slaves would be gradually given their freedom. This was the specific proposal of the Tallmadge Amendment. The South was very much against it. The South saw this as an attempt by the Northerners, to take away the institution of slavery, at least the start of it. So this was a dilemma. Again, the North did not want to give up control of the Senate. They didn't want to give up a majority to Southern slavery states. The Northern free states at the time had an equal amount of senators. So they came up with a compromise. Henry Clay, the same man that gave us the American system, he is going to propose the Missouri Compromise in 1820. This is the compromise. Missouri would become a slave state. Now, in order to keep the balance, equal senators from slave states and free states, if you look over here to the map on the right, this territory up here, you see the ME, that's Maine. Well, back then, that was just a part of Massachusetts. That was together one territory, one state. So Henry Clay proposed we break Massachusetts in half and we add Maine as a free state, keeping the balance in the Senate. So they added Maine as a free state, keeping the balance in the Senate. And to try to avoid this conflict in the future, Henry Clay, under the Missouri Compromise, also proposed a type of border to slavery so this doesn't happen again. The coordinates is the 3630 line. If you look over here on the map, this red line here represents the 3630 line. And basically, Henry Clay proposed slavery would not be allowed in any more territories above this line. They're trying to keep slavery in the South and free states in the North. Congress agreed. The Missouri Compromise was passed. But this is just the beginning of this dilemma as we add more land to America, whether they will be free or slave states. So you can argue, that there was division during this time of the era of good feelings concerning slavery, and not the morality, the extension of slavery. Under the era of good feelings, let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. Appointed as Secretary of State under James Monroe, a future American president, son of our second president, John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams is remembered as one of our greatest Secretary of States. Not so much as a president, but he's remembered as one of our greatest Secretary of States. Remember, their job is to work for our government in terms of foreign affairs, diplomat, etc. And he made some quality achievements, like the Treaty of 1818, also called the Convention of 1818. To prevent conflicts with Canada, the Treaty of 1818 fixed the border between America and Canada to the north. If you look on the map to the right, the Treaty of 1818 negotiated this border, or the Convention of 1818, same name, that would fix the American and Canadian border to the north, pretty much at the 49th parallel. When you talk about coordinates, see the 49 right here, degrees? At the 49th parallel. This was an achievement, an important achievement by John Quincy Adams. Another big achievement as Secretary of State in serving our country, it was really odd that in the eastern part of the United States, we controlled everything in our part of North America except for Florida. Florida was holding out. Florida belonged to Spain. Well, John Quincy Adams receives the credit for negotiating the purchase of Florida in 1819. So the pieces of America are coming together. In 1819, he negotiated the Florida Purchase Treaty, that you see over here to the right, adding now in the green Florida to America. And by the way, the Florida Purchase Treaty, sometimes you'll see it on documents and tests as the Adam-Onis Treaty. Now, another accomplishment by John Quincy Adams, and this is truly going to have a huge impact for years to come, more so than at the time that he did it. We were concerned, America was concerned of Europeans settling close to us in North America, especially over here, if you look at the map to the right, especially in the Oregon Territory. There was Russian settlers that were starting to come. We were arguing over this territory with the British. We were concerned about our neighbors to the south in Mexico and South America. If the Europeans make any new colonies or take over nations there, it could be a threat to us, our economy and our military. So John Quincy Adams wrote on behalf of the president, the Monroe Doctrine, which passed in 1823. And the picture to the right really describes what the Monroe Doctrine represented. John Quincy Adams' words on behalf of the president, the Monroe Doctrine was a warning to Europe, a warning to European nations to no longer make colonies in our side of the world, the Western Hemisphere. A warning to Europe to no longer make colonies in the Western Hemisphere. That's part of it. And the second part is to not get involved with the nations of the Western Hemisphere. Like, don't try to take over Like, we're going to respect your colonies because Europeans had some colonies in the Western Hemisphere. But we're telling them you cannot expand in the Western Hemisphere. You cannot take over governments in the Western Hemisphere. You cannot create any more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. This was our warning to them, or we would see it as a threat. Like the picture to the right, Uncle Sam saying, Monroe Doctrine, hands off. It's almost we're saying, like, we're going to be the big kid on the block over here. We're going to get involved here. The rest of you stay out. And at the time, again, it was kind of a warning to Russia about Oregon. It didn't turn into any major conflicts, but we're going to use it in the future. The Monroe Doctrine will be used in the future as an excuse for us to get involved or to warn Europeans to get out of South America and other parts. Now, American culture is always important. Whenever we make progress in terms of culture, and when our culture becomes world renowned, that people from other parts of the world read it and appreciate it, and of course, our culture that develops at this time will influence our education system for years to come. Students today in American high school read some great works of art or appreciate paintings that were taking place in this part of America in the early 1800s. That nationalism, this pride that we felt in our nation, it's going to reflect. You're going to see it. And even our democratic ideas, you're going to see it in literature. A particular writing group out of New York emerged known as the Knickerbocker Group. You know, the basketball team, the New York Knicks, this is where it came from. A group of writers that emerged in the earlier 1800s. And these writers emphasized American themes, especially things like history, important events in American history, early history. Washington Irving was a famous short story writer. Some of you have heard of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He also wrote a biography of George Washington. There was James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote some very well-known novels, including Last of the Mohicans. So the Knickerbockers represented a group of writers that reflected a lot of nationalism in history. And then there was a group of transcendentalists. We would see a movement of writers known as transcendentalism. They were very much influenced by Romanticism in Europe. And it had a very individualistic quality to their writing. Individual ideas and independence was in their writings. Some of the famous writers and poets: Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was one of those that advocated for self-reliance, optimism, and freedom. Henry David Thoreau was a member of this transcendentalist movement. And he wrote an essay. It was called An Essay on Civil Disobedience, that would impact Americans and people in other parts of the world for years to come. In another lecture, we're going to talk about how America is going to be involved in a war with Mexico. And Thoreau believed in, pacifism. He's going to refuse to pay his taxes because of that war. So in this essay, he writes an essay on civil disobedience. He promotes this idea of nonviolent resistance. When you see an injustice, to resist with nonviolence, like he did in not paying his taxes. An essay on civil disobedience would be an influence of Gandhi when the people of India resisted British rule. An essay on civil disobedience will influence Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement. Also uniquely American and part of our culture, the Hudson River School of Art will emerge in the early 1800s. American artists would gain international fame, especially those works of art that reflected the beautiful scenic scenes in America of nature. Usually when you see, beautiful landscapes in America in the early 1800s, it was a result of the Hudson River School of Art. The major theme here in the era of good feelings is where you need to kind of compare and contrast here. Okay. What was happening in America that gave it the title, the era of good feelings? But at the same time, I gave you evidence that it was not an era of good feelings. You need to be able to summarize those reasons, those conflicts. And maybe it was just the foundation or conflicts, or maybe you didn't get that seriously. But you need to recognize there was issues that were beginning to divide America during the era of good feelings.